This Choircast podcast is brought to you by the book Too Much and Not Enough, Sacred Thoughts Said Out Loud by Karen Schock. This book is for anyone who has big questions about God and is feeling like a misfit among the people who seem to have it all figured out. Journey with me as we dive into the hard stuff and ask the questions no one else seems to want to ask. Available now on Amazon.
Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No? All right, you have reached another book club episode of the Unbelief Podcast, and we are continuing in the new year to tell a story from the ancient spiritual text called the Book of Exodus from the Bible in the Old Testament about coming out of a difficult time into something new. That's the story of the Exodus. Last week, we talked about the way that two women stood up to the most powerful man in the world, Pharaoh. They rescued lots and lots of babies. And then today we get the story of one of the most important figures in the entire collection of books we call the Bible, that entire library, this guy named Moses. This is one of those stories in the Bible that whether or not you grew up going to church or have read the Bible, it is such a part of the vernacular of, the sort of human canon of stories that it is very likely that you have heard this story before. It is a familiar story. It's a story that's been told in a lot of different ways, several movies, and just to children in all kinds of different cultural settings throughout history. It's a beautiful story, and yet sometimes the familiar stories to us allow us to gloss over the depth and the power. It allows us just to read them as something familiar and not really engage with what they are saying. And so as we look at this part of the book of Exodus, I want you to let go of your preconceived ideas of what this is saying and really listen. So this starts in Exodus chapter 2. It says, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son." Now this is right after we hear Pharaoh commanding that all of the males that are born to Hebrew women are supposed to be killed. And so it says, when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. So at this point, Moses is a 3-month-old. He's not a tiny baby. He is much more viable. She has sort of brought him through some of the hardest times in the ancient world. A lot of babies died when they were very young, but at this point, he's getting loud, he's getting squirmy, and it says, when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, plastered it with bitumen and pitch, and put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. Basically, she takes a basket and she turns it into a tiny boat for this baby, and she puts it in a river. Now, it may seem super dangerous, super bad, but this woman is not stupid. And she knows where this river is headed, and she knows that the uncomfortableness of this basket is going to make this baby scream and cry all the way down the river. And so this baby screaming and crying is going to attract attention, and she knows what happens down the river. There are Egyptians down the river. There are people in power down the river. And it seems, if you put yourself in her headspace, you imagine that she's hoping that somebody will rescue her baby. And this is the love of a mother, right? The love of a mother that cares so much about the safety of her child that she would risk losing access to her child forever so that her child will live. This is actually something that we see in our modern world, in adoption, right? Where women choose to carry their children to term, but for whatever reason, they know that child will not have the life that they want it to have. They may know that they can't care for them, that they don't have enough resources, or that they're in an unsafe situation, whatever the case. They have the baby, and in the modern sense, they put it in a basket, they put it down the river, and they trust that someone is going to care for that baby in a way that they cannot. That baby will not be at risk anymore. And then you have the sister of Moses play this beautiful role. We don't get her name here, but later we get her name. Her name is Miriam. And it says that his sister, Miriam, stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Now, in this world, Miriam would have been helping with the baby. She would have been helping with Moses, caring and tending for him. The girls learned how to do all of that, not by going to a class at a hospital, going to a Lamaze class. That's not how they learned how to have a baby. They learned that by being with the women in their world and watching them and helping care for children. And so his sister has been involved in his care. But it seems clear that his sister is not old enough to be expected to have a child. And so while an adult woman following this basket with the baby crying in it down the river would be suspect, right? That maybe she had a baby and didn't, kill the male baby like the Pharaoh has instructed. His sister doesn't attract that kind of attention. So we have this beautiful imagery of a sister watching the basket. I imagine she is poised at the ready if something happens, the basket tips. She watches what happens because the basket is headed where some really powerful people are. Yeah, the next verse 5, it says, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the river while her attendants walked beside the river. This is a beautiful moment because you've got to know that the people who live in this area, they know when the Pharaoh's daughter goes down. They know where she this is going to be the place she bathes all the time. They know this. They know when it happens, right? She is royalty. If when the queen goes out every Tuesday, you know that you can stand right there by the gates and catch a glimpse of the queen. It's the same here with Pharaoh's daughter coming down to bathe in the river. It seems that the hope of this mother is to have her son in a basket crying, passing by this woman, knowing that another woman hearing a baby crying will be moved to rescue the baby. The daughter of the Pharaoh came down to bathe. Her attendants are walking beside the river. And then it says, she saw the basket among the reeds and has her maids bring it. and she opens it. She sees the child. He's crying, right? And it's we get a sense a little bit, it's not, she heard it, but she saw it, and you heard it. A baby crying there's this human response. If you've ever heard a baby crying, you know that there is this just visceral, evolutionary response to help this baby. That's what happens. We're oh my gosh, we have to help this baby. We have to pick it up. Somebody deal with that baby who's crying. Yeah, she has that experience. And so they fetch the basket. She sees the baby. So she takes pity on him. And she looks at him. This must be one of the Hebrew children. It's a male. Hebrews circumcise their babies. So it's probably clear when she opens the basket, because of his circumcision, that he's a Hebrew child. And his sister is right there, Miriam. Miriam has been following Moses and is poised to take action. She says, "Shall I go get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And then Pharaoh's daughter does something dramatic. And if you aren't thinking, if you are just reading this story, you know the progression, you miss this moment. Because remember, the Pharaoh has ordered the killing of all of the male Hebrew children. And it is clear the daughter of Pharaoh has picked up this child, knows it is a Hebrew male child, knows that the instructions are to kill this child. And when Miriam, Moses' sister, says, "Do you want me to go get a Hebrew nurse?" It says, Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." Pharaoh's daughter doesn't agree with Pharaoh's policy. And when she is faced with the ability to do something about that, when she is faced with the choice, either participate in this injustice or stand up for what you believe, not by saying something, but by doing something, by an act of civil disobedience, she does it. Again, in this story, we have woman after woman standing up and fighting for justice, taking on enormous amounts of risk. And so Pharaoh's daughter says yes. And so Miriam, of course, goes back to her mom, to Moses' mom, to the mother of the baby that Pharaoh's daughter just chose to save, and says, "I have figured it out." What we were hoping, that Pharaoh's daughter would rescue him, yeah, she found him. She's going to rescue him. And I was there, and I said, do you want a Hebrew woman to nurse him? And she said, yes. So Mom, come on. You're going to get to raise your son. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the celebration for just a moment in Moses' house with his mom and his sister? Oh my gosh. Screaming, dancing, all of the things. And now pull ourselves together, act like this is a difficult task, go to Pharaoh's daughter, and Pharaoh's daughter says to Moses' mom, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you wages." Moses' mom is getting paid to raise Moses. Now, it's not clear in the text exactly where this happens, but it is quite possible that Moses' mom moves in somewhere into the official buildings, homes of the Pharaoh, that she is one of the Pharaoh's daughter's staff now. And so she is caring quite possibly for Moses in Pharaoh's house, that Moses is right there. But either way, it says in verse 10, when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So whether or not he grew up as a tiny baby right there for the first year or two, he eventually moves into Pharaoh's house. He grows up as royalty. She names him Moses, it says, because she said, I drew him out of the water. It's interesting, this name Moses. It sounds similar to the Hebrew word drew. But scholars say that it's most likely it's actually most likely a Hebrew transliteration of an Egyptian name. Like you have Tutmosis, and this is like baby boy child, right? Like this is kind of his name. And it's preserved in this Hebrew text, and it sounds kind of like Drew, but it's a very Egyptian name. Moses walks around with an Egyptian name, with an Egyptian personality, with all of the trappings and privileges of a son of Pharaoh's daughter. Do you catch that? Moses grows up as Pharaoh's grandson. Now, we don't know if Pharaoh quite understands all of it. It's not clear whether or not he's an adopted grandson or whether or not he's just a blood grandson. That's not clear. But either way, he grows up in the royal house as her grandson. And then we get this story of who Moses is. But I don't want to go there yet, because I want to talk about the civil disobedience. This is the second time we've seen this in as many chapters. People who are not the most powerful people standing up against oppression. But this is a very different way of standing up. Right? We have the example of Shiphrah and Puah from last week, who get called into Pharaoh's, assuming his throne room to answer for not doing what he directly directed them to do. And they stand up right there to his face and say, no. They make up a lie. And it's funny because they make up this lie and they're called righteous. They say they did what God wants them to do. God wanted them to lie to Pharaoh. That's another piece of content altogether. But here we have a different form of disobedience. Right? You've got the people that stand up, speak out, do that. And then you've got people like Pharaoh's daughter. In my experience is that there are moments where you have the opportunity to stand up and speak truth to power. But a lot more often, you are presented with an opportunity like Pharaoh's daughter, where you're not going to get called into Pharaoh's throne room to speak to him. But you know something that is not right in the world. And you get presented with an opportunity where you can choose to go along with the unjust system, or you can choose to do the right thing, to take action in your personal life, in this specific setting, in this specific decision, and act. Act in the right way. Even though the right way is against the policies, the structure, the power, even though acting in the right way might represent some amount of risk to you, you have the opportunity to do the right thing or to do the legal thing, to do the right thing or to do the thing according to company policy, to do the right thing or to do the thing according to our family system. And standing up against oppression, against evil, against injustice in those settings looks very much more like a normal part of life, like raising a baby, than it does like standing in front of a world leader and speaking truth to them. Yeah. In life, sometimes you just do the right thing. You don't make a show. It's not about that. It's about creating the world that should be by your actions. It's about just doing the thing that should be done, even though the world, the policies, the structure, the family system says it shouldn't be done. Sometimes you stand in front of Pharaoh and you don't back down. Sometimes you pick the baby out of the basket and care for it because that's just what you should do. So Moses now, verse 11, we fast forward through Moses' life. We don't get anything else. We just get he grows up in Pharaoh's house, and now we find out who Moses is. It says one day, after Moses has grown up, he goes out to his people and he saw their forced labor. Now it says his people, which it implies that maybe he knows that he's a Hebrew. My guess is at some point they are bathing and he notices his circumcision and how it looks different from the other people. And he asks his mom. She tells him, and most likely she says, don't say anything. You're an Egyptian. You were raised in my house, right? But he goes out and he sees his people and saw their forced labor. Remember, they are now enslaved. They are doing all of these horrible things. And it says that Pharaoh is just being the worst to them. He sees their forced labor. And then he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. So we're getting a sense more and more of what's happening in this culture. This culture is shifting from a culture where prior to this, when Jacob's son, like when we have Joseph in the leadership, where there was this like partnership between the Hebrews and the Pharaohs, it has shifted towards something really horrible. It's not just kind of unjust. It's not just forced labor. We have a whole culture that is developed now where violence against these slaves is okay. So he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Again, his own people. It feels like he knows he is one of them. He's looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he kills the Egyptian. Now, it seems clear in the rest of the story that it's reinforced that murder is wrong. He should not have killed the Egyptian, but we see who Moses is here. Moses isn't someone random that God chooses. Moses has at his core a sense of justice and what needs to be done that motivates him to take real risk and to act. That's important. It's going to come up in just a minute. He kills the Egyptian, but he knows he's done wrong. He hides him in the sand. So he goes out the next day. There are Hebrews fighting, and he thought nobody saw it. But the Hebrews saw it. And when he confronts the Hebrews who are fighting, the Hebrew says, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? You mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses freaks out, realizes this is known, and then eventually, because this kind of stuff gets out, Pharaoh hears about it. And because Moses has killed an Egyptian, he seeks to kill Moses. So Moses flees from Pharaoh. Now, this is the moment at which, if you know the story, you may notice that Moses is actually an embodiment in this part of the story of the next part of the story, of the people eventually fleeing Egypt. But instead, Moses goes out into the desert. He gets married. There's this wonderful, beautiful moment where Moses resets his life. He goes out in the desert, finds a wife, gets married, has kids, and things are normal. Things are in this interesting in-between space. It's a space that we have in our lives every once in a while, where we get a chance to reset, to figure out who we are in this new moment, to heal, maybe to take some of our worst tendencies, process them, let go of them, start moving in a new direction. Maybe we used to get so angry we would want to become violent like Moses, and we get in danger, we flee, we end up in a desert in our own life, and in that desert we get to let go of that thing. We get to let go of the anger. We get to let go of whatever it is that got us, that made us flee to the desert, that changed our life, and we lost everything. And Moses loses his family, his friends, his people. And he has to reset. He has to figure out who he is now. Who he is apart from his power as part of the Pharaoh's family, as apart from his people as a Hebrew. He's alone with himself in the desert. Figures out who he is. And then verse 23, chapter 2, after a long time, the king of Egypt died. Pharaoh dies. The one who's trying to kill Moses dies. And in this part of the world, right, in any part of the world, when the most powerful person in the world dies, it spreads, right? It's not just confined to wherever they lived. The whole world eventually knows about it. Moses knows about it, and he knows that he might have a chance to go back home, to reunite with his family, maybe to see his adopted mom, the Pharaoh's daughter. And who knows? Maybe one of his brothers is Pharaoh now. It says the Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Their cry for help rose up to God from their slavery. And then it says, God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites and took notice of them. And here we come to a really important idea in the Bible. It's this idea of remembering. This idea that when there's a covenant, when there's agreement, that sometimes people forget. And when they forget, they stop acting according to that agreement. Right? They stop doing the things they agreed to do, being the person they agreed to be. And in this setting, it says that it implies that God has forgotten the agreement, right? Because from the Hebrew point of view, God said that they were going to be prosperous, they were going to be a great nation, they were going to be all of these things, and they aren't. They are enslaved, and they have to be saying, okay, God, what is going on? It says they cried out to God. And when it says God remembered it's not really saying that God recalled it, right? In English, sometimes remembering means recalling. No one here thought that God didn't remember in the sense of recalling the agreement. This remembering is implying action. What it's saying is that God had not been acting according to the covenant that God made with the people. And now, when it says God remembered it, it's saying that no. God is about to act on that covenant. And that's what happens next. Right, the people enslaved, God is about to act. When it says God remembers the covenant, this is for the original hearers. They're like, oh, here it comes. God's going to bring the power, right? God's going to bring all of the godness to this moment. Wait, just wait. We're about to see a heavenly, divine smackdown happen. It's on. Because God remembered. And when you remember, you act. God is about to act. But this is interesting because it says he hears them and then he acts. He hears them, then he remembers. He hears them. They cry out. Yeah. And remember, these stories haven't lasted for millennia, informed the lives of people, started movements of justice because they just simply happen. There's some sort of history. No. These stories have lasted for millennia because they tell us who we are, who God is, and how we are supposed to act in the world. That's it. That's what these stories do and have done over and over again. And so when we are reading them, we aren't just reading them as a sort of objective history in the past. We are reading them to figure out what they mean for us. The story of Moses, the story of the Exodus, the story of like slaves being freed. Yeah. As a person who grew up in America, the transatlantic slave trade, civil rights movement, yeah. All of those things had in part their source in this story. Yeah. In those moments, the people who claimed the Bible as their story, they started doing the same things as the Hebrews. They were crying out to God, for God to remember in the biblical sense, for God to act, for God to send a redeemer, for God to send someone to do something about the oppression. That's what brought these stories to life throughout history, all over the world. All different times, all different cultures. Because here's where this lands for us. When we hear the cry of the oppressed, we remember, we recall who we are. And my experience is that whether or not you are a spiritual person, whether or not you're sure that God exists, when you see real oppression, when you see real desperation, real poverty, there is something inside you as a human that responds. Right? That's why charitable organizations put very affecting pictures of poverty, of injustice in their publicity material, because when we see it, when we hear the cries of the oppressed, something inside us responds at a human level. And we have a moment like Pharaoh's daughter where we can act or not. But I want to dial it back just a minute, just a little bit from these epic themes to invite us to think about remembering in a very normal way. Because I think sometimes with the busyness of our life, we can be like God seems to be in the story and just forget. We become people. We do things. We stop doing things. Not intentionally. Not because we necessarily have a moment where we think, oh, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm going to stop being that. We just follow life in this weird direction, and all of a sudden we end up so far from ourselves. And so I as I read this story, I am thinking, how do I need to remember my role in different relationships, right? Sometimes we can shift in our relationships from really who we should be, who our role needs us to be, requires us, demands of us to be, into something else. And and our role. We aren't remembering our role. We aren't fulfilling our commitment, that the thing that role in our life needs us to be as a brother, as a son, as a spouse, as a whatever it is, as a father, as an uncle, as a niece, as a child. We need to remember that role. And remember, not by recall, to act, to shift our actions back. I sometimes in these moments start thinking, okay, wait, but who am I really? When I think about the core of who I am, who is that? And who does that call me to be? How have I gotten off of sort of my essential beingness? One of the ways I try to get back to that, try to figure out who that was, is I'll go back in time and I'll think about my younger self. And even though some things are completely unrealistic, the further you go back, like I wanted to be an astronaut, and I don't have vision is good enough for that. But on a bigger scale, asking who did my younger self want me to be? Who did I imagine myself being when I was the age I am now? And how do I need to act differently as a result? How have I gotten off track? And oftentimes where I end up is in this even bigger question. Asking myself, really, who does the world need me to be? Right? What do I have to offer the world that is me? That is uniquely me? And I'm not meaning I need to go to a president or a king or a parliament and stand. I'm talking about me, my skills, my personality. Who am I? And then who does the world need that person to be? What role can I play to make the world a more just and loving place? Like, how can I affect my little pocket? Yeah. How do I remember that? Like, not just like, what does it need me to be, but like, what do I need to do? Right? What do I need to do in my relationships? What do I need to do to get myself back on track? Who I really am, who the younger version of me thought I would be. What do I need to do differently to make my world the place it needs to be? Yeah. Remembering. That's the key. We call this a book club because it's a club, in a sense. We have this community called Not Church. It's full of people who are not sure sometimes, a lot of times, we believe in God, but we do want to be spiritual. We've got this spiritual history, most of us. And we have this thing called Not Church. It's like a group of us who are trying to figure out the spiritual beliefs that work for us, the spiritual beliefs that help us be the best version of ourselves, help us find a purpose greater than ourselves, to find life in ancient spiritual texts that have been used to hurt us, to traumatize us, to process that trauma, to post memes, and to be there for each other. The reason we call it Not Church is because somebody said it was like all the things you wanted from church, but without somebody telling you you're going to hell because you believe the wrong things. I think you would love that. And the way you do it is you go to patreon.com/skepticpastor, patreon.com/skepticpastor. It's $3 a month. We charge $3 a month because we're not going to ask you to give a percentage of your income. It's pay for what you get. If it works for you, great. If it stops working, just stop paying. Yeah. $3 a month gets you that. And we've got merch at noomacommunity.com/store, NOOMA community.com/store. But wherever you're listening to this podcast, give us all the stars. Write an actual review. Write a couple of words. That stuff really helps. And yeah, forward it to your friend. That's it. That's the podcast. Shout out to the Choir Network, to Patheos, to Matthew and Keith, who make everything happen. Now, get out of here. Go do something to make the world a better place. Okay? We'll see you next time.